so wonderful to have Pam Altendorf today, a guest who really requires no introduction. And when a person has a guest of such caliber, I think it's better just to turn it over to Pam Altendorf right away rather than sing her accolades, because there's so much to say about Pam. And thank you so much for coming out to tell us a little bit of what's on your mind and what's on your heart today with Minnesota politics.
Yeah, well, thanks, Wes, for inviting me. I am a state representative of the Red Wing area, District 28, and just got to know Wes this last year as he's running. So I do want to say thank you, Wes, for running to be a state representative from the Rochester area. We it would be a blessing to our state to have you serving, and we really need to flip the Minnesota House this year. So I appreciate the work you're doing. I know how difficult it is to run for campaigns and how much help and support that we all need here in Minnesota to flip the House. So I guess you reached out to me, but I had posted on Facebook yesterday that at a congressional level, at the federal level, Governor Walz was subpoenaed September 18th. He is to come in front of the Education and Workforce Committee. So he was subpoenaed yesterday, and I posted on Facebook. I guess I didn't check this morning, but I think it's had over 100 shares, and I know that's why you reached out. But I was myself personally being in the state legislature, and literally, the Republicans trying to sound the alarm on the amount of fraud that's happening in the state. I was delighted to see the subpoena being put out yesterday and served to Governor Walz. It's well deserved and well past time.
Right. It's not just one of those issues that people can conveniently make political hay out of, but it's actually serious issues of fraud, waste, and abuse regarding several programs in Minnesota, not least of which is this Feeding Our Future fraud, maybe the elder nutrition program being ripped off, and Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, and we could go back to daycare scandal, but what's new about the Feeding Our Future fraud that might be of interest to Congress? The
You know,
education.
this has just gone on so long, and I think many reasons, things that are happening in Minnesota is our media is very much to blame. These things should be exposed. The media is really meant to be a watchdog and to report the news of both sides politically, to not be biased, and to inform the public. And here in Minnesota, I would say the media has done a grave injustice to us because, frankly, so many in Minnesota just are unaware, or we only know bits and pieces of what is happening politically or through the state government. And I always say, people, myself, I grew up on a farm. I grew up in a Democrat family. I am a Republican, and right now, in the Minnesota State House. But so many of these issues, if we were allowed to have the same amount of information, which we should, we would agree on these. These should not be biased. They should not be partisan issues. Democrats and Republicans alike should be against wasteful spending of our tax dollars, should be against fraud happening in our state. And right now, it is rampant fraud happening in Minnesota. In fact, there's someone, I think he's with the American Experiment, Bill Glahn. He started a scandal tracker, a fraud tracker in the state of Minnesota, which under Governor Walz now, we're over that tracker, I believe, is over $500 million of proven fraud under the Walz administration. I believe there's much more than that. But you asked what happened. It's just the Feeding Our Future fraud. Now think about this. In Minnesota, our government is completely locked, completely controlled by Democrat control. From the governor to the Senate to the House is all Democrat control. But take it another step. The Attorney General is Keith Ellison. And then the Secretary of State. So everything is locked by the Democrat Party. And this is not a good situation for any state. You know, there is a lot of wisdom in having split government so that there's checks and balances. And that, frankly, is not happening in Minnesota right now. We do not have these checks and balances. And so with this complete lock of our state, I think also has become for the Democrats pride and maybe pushing so far. They think that they're invincible, that they cannot be caught. The Feeding Our Future fraud, for those of you that don't know, $250 million federal COVID scam. It is the largest, Minnesota, it is the largest COVID pandemic scam that happened. And basically it happened here in Minnesota. And think about this, under the Biden administration, it was so big that even the Biden administration could not turn a blind eye to this and needed to pursue this federally. And I think that should tell Minnesotans the scope of the level of fraud that we're facing here in Minnesota. But more than that, this is just being dragged out. And there have been, you know, some court cases I wrote down. There's been 23 convictions. There's a lot more happening. But basically, it just shows you the scope of the fraud. And it's mostly gone unchecked by our government, by our governor, by our attorney general, and they're all trying to turn a blind eye to what's happening here in Minnesota.
And I think by one account, there were over 54 independent indictments by the Department of Justice of the United States of America. And then another number I heard was over 70 indictments. And several of those are here in Rochester, Minnesota. But this is truly the largest pandemic scam that there was, and as you say, and referring to the letter to Governor Walz, his subpoena, as chief, and I'm quoting, as chief executive and the highest ranking official in the state of Minnesota, you are responsible for the MDE and its administration of the FCNP. And then he's also responsible for, so the United States House Committee becomes interested because it's the Education and the Workforce Committee, also the United States Department of Agriculture, and as they relate to oversight of the Minnesota Department of Education. And then, of course, the federal child nutrition programs that they call the FCNP and the Feeding Our Future FOP. So these were nonprofits. I mean, these Feeding Our Future scamsters, they set up this nonprofit to siphon monies off from a very generous program, which we set up for the people of the United States and the children. Think of it. It sounds very fantastic. Feeding Our Future. It's a beautiful slogan, but it results in siphoning off and skimming off money for a lot of scamsters. Does that ring a bell with you at all?
Yeah, you know, exactly what you said. And one thing I want to say to the public, and I think people are starting to wake up to this, you know, but the Democrat Party and the people who are manipulating the people of Minnesota and of our country, they are masters at marketing. They are masters at communication. And I tell people that they put this cute name on it. So Feeding Our Future. Okay.
Right.
Who wouldn't want to support Feeding Our Future? Of course. I mean, that's something
Can't be against.
we should buy into that, right?
Right.
But what I tell people is really, and start using your discernment, is cute name, bad idea. Cute name, bad idea. And so many of these things are meant to manipulate the public. So emotionally, the public is buying into a system of who doesn't want to feed our future. But then there are bad players. I mean, this is just how the world operates. There are scammers. There are people who are dishonest. There are people that'll steal. That is the world we live in. And when you have a nonprofit set up, like we did, Feeding Our Future, and then we have a state of Minnesota with no checks and balances, no oversight, no one watching this program, it emboldens people to scam the government. And the problem is, this does fall back on the Democrat Party and the Governor Walz administration, because there was no oversight. And in fact, even when it was first reported, that this was happening through MDE, they basically just kind of poo-pooed the whole idea and nothing happened. It continued. The fraud continued after they were first made aware of this.
That's right. That's right. So much fraud. And to think it was also done through the auspices of so-called nonprofits. Is there going to be any interest maybe in coming years of researching some of the nonprofits that get set up to, I mean, to use a term sarcastically, they sort of go about the Lord's business, but a lot of these folks are sometimes unscrupulous with their business practices. If you've got a nonprofit and you're making $175,000 a year or $90,000 a year, maybe you're profiting a little too much by your volunteerism. I can't afford that sort of compassion. Well, any thoughts on where the $250 million might have gone? I mean, it lined people's pockets, and I guess they bought themselves some influence with that money too, perhaps.
Right. This wouldn't have been a difficult thing for, if we were a serious government, if the Walz administration was at all serious, and this really should be the big red flag. This would not have been difficult for any person, even though it was during COVID, when they're talking about the numbers of people, the numbers of kids that they were apparently feeding at these different locations. You literally could have sent someone to sit on the street in a car safely. Again, this is during COVID. I mean, don't tell me you couldn't have investigated this. Someone could have been sitting in a car, the amount of kids that they said were feeding, and could have witnessed with their own eyes that nobody was going into these locations. There was no activity there. So what they did is they set up these fronts, these locations where, they were supposed to be feeding children, and it would have been very, very easy to start investigating if we were serious. But then, it also makes you wonder, not only were we not serious, but then where were these dollars going? Who were they funding? Why were they allowing this amount of money to being funneled through the state of Minnesota, and for what reasons? I mean, these are all valid questions that should be asked of Governor Walz, and why there was basically no oversight, and it was continued to be allowed to happen. I have not seen any serious action coming from the Democrat Party or from Governor Walz, condemning what happened. And also, I don't believe anyone lost their job. There's been no accountability of worker, the employees of the state. There's been no accountability. I don't believe anyone's been fired. And again, this should not be a partisan issue. If you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, you should frown upon fraud, and you should frown upon wasted dollars in our state, and for scammers. That's really what this was. You asked where the money went. I believe there was trips. There was homes bought with this money. I believe there was jewelry, and anyone can search that. I don't have that right in front of me, but it's well documented. And then on top of that, also, you can see some of this money that was given to these fraudsters through the Feeding Our Future program also worked the dollars back into people's campaigns. That the people who were involved, who were being charged with the Feeding Our Future, donated to the Democrats' campaigns. And I just really wish we should all call, when things are wrong. We should all call it out. This should not be a party line. You should not be a Democrat, and you should not be ignoring scandal and fraud happening in Minnesota. You absolutely should not. It should be something as one unified voice, that we say there is a line, and we are not going to tolerate this money funneling system to be happening in Minnesota. But that it's not just the Feeding Our Future. When I say money funneling system, that is something I have stood up on the Minnesota House floor and said, several times that the Democrats have the money funneling system down in the state of Minnesota down to a T, and they're using the nonprofits is the tool to funnel the money.
And even when Willie Jett, the Minnesota Education Commissioner, spoke about the Feeding Our Future fraud, he did sort of a Kansas City shuffle and dodged the questions. And that YouTube video of him being questioned about, he was questioned by the Minnesota state government, but it was via a Zoom meeting. I think he should have had to come in and face the people that were questioning him, because technical difficulties always comes into play. But there's also a report by the Minnesota Office of Legislative Auditor that was posted by Congressman Brad Finstad, and we have to thank our congressman also for calling out the fraud, waste, and abuse in Minnesota at the Minnesota Department of Education. And I'm hopeful that, there's red flags that went off. For instance, one report here says that payments to Feeding Our Future increased by 2,800% in one fiscal year. And when you have that kind of expenditure coming in just suddenly as a line, or a group of entries in a ledger, that should just flag everything to just, okay, stop, hold on, where's this money going, right?
Exactly. No, exactly. And that is the point, that we need to stop turning away from and just somehow ignoring that this is happening in our state. This is not sustainable for our state. Like I said, I'm not sure if there's any other state in the country that has a fraud tracker. And Minnesotans should be ashamed that we have a unchecked, abusive government that is taking advantage of the Minnesota taxpayers, and there's no accountability happening in our state. Now, you mentioned we have the Office of the Legislative Auditor. Okay, so the OLA. And what they do is they are auditing several different agencies per year. But what they said about this, specifically with the MDE and the Feeding Our Future fraud, and this is a quote, is they said there was pervasive non-compliance of MDE happening. And yet, when the Office of the Legislative Auditor, OLA, reports this, there's no teeth behind it. There's no consequences. So it's being reported, and yet the Governor Walz administration, our Attorney General, no one is pursuing stopping this. And again, if they're not stopping it, then one might be led to believe that they approve it, or one should question, where is the money going? Who is that money going to? Who is it profiting? And why are we not actively trying to stop this fraud in Minnesota?
I have to agree. And as you're speaking, I'm searching through my phone and my computer, which keeps crashing, searching frantically for that list of donors from the Feeding Our Future, the list of convicts and those received indictments from the Department of Justice. I'm looking for that document regarding the number of people, politicians who received donations from those individuals. It's truly astonishing. The charts are really telling. And of course, as I need that, I can't lay my fingertips on it. But
I can also talk about, Wes, that just yesterday in the Minnesota Reformer, which is a very, it's a liberal publication, September 4th, Minnesota Reformer, they are now reporting that autism centers are connected also to the Feeding Our Future fraud, and some of the same players that set up these nonprofits for the Feeding Our Future is also playing in these autism centers. I don't know that we have enough information, to really crack down on this. But again, the Minnesota Reformer reported this yesterday. They are a left-leaning publication, And just to give you a couple of numbers, and again, when you said the numbers increase so much, there should be a red flag, right? Well, anyone with
Right.
a business background, anyone with common sense should be red flagging this huge increase in expenditures. So let me give you some numbers of the autism centers. 2018, there was 41 providers. This last year, 328. That's a 700% increase in autism centers. In 2018, the budget, 6 million. Last year, 192 million. So again, this should be a huge red flag. I believe that expense, I don't remember now, I didn't write it down, but it was maybe a 7,000% increase, 6 million to 192 million. Okay, Minnesotans, I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, but we have a fraud problem and we need to look at it. We need to take this seriously. We need to vet it out and we need to stop it because apparently there are scammers, people that understand our government is not doing their due diligence to protect the Minnesota taxpayers' dollars. And so now this has set up this, I would say, we're like there's a target on our back. Like these scammers are coming into Minnesota because it's almost like free money, free money. They set up the nonprofit, and that
Mhm.
by all means on paper right now, it looks like that's happening in our autism centers as well, that they're setting up these new nonprofits and they're claiming again a great thing. Who wouldn't want to support an autism center, right? So
Right.
a cute name, bad idea, where they're setting up a nonprofit. And is this happening now in the autism centers where, how did we see this much of an increase of 41 providers in 2018 up to 328 providers? This needs to be investigated. This needs to be taken very seriously.
And sadly, autism centers or nonprofits regarding autism have been used before about 12 years ago, and it hit the press, and there were some politicians involved in an autism, I want to say Rochester Autism Group. It's called RT. And I think $40,000 went missing, and the treasurer ended up getting in some trouble for that. But it's sad that, when people think of nonprofit, you think of people good naturedly helping other people. We have a very high trust society in Minnesota, and we've set up these programs because we do want to help people, and we are naturally compassionate people. I mean, Minnesotans are probably the friendliest and most welcoming people on planet Earth in terms of, well, brag it up a little bit. But sure, we want to help our neighbor. The winters are long and cold, and you want to be there when somebody needs help or needs a hand up. But we are kind of suckers for this kind of thing. And looking at I found the table that I was looking for, the Feeding Our Future scandal. We're looking at $250 million. The Child Care Assistance Program, just in 2019 to 2024, this is only what they found. So in this period of time, just 5 years or 4 years actually, Child Care Assistance Program, $100 million. Frontline workers bonus pay ripped off for $45.5 million. That's almost $46 million. Medicaid frauds, there's 4 different frauds that revolved around a total of about $50 million. Unemployment benefits ripped off to the tune of $4,700,000. SNAP programs ripped off over 4 million. Medicare, again, other Medicaid fraud programs totaling into another $15 million. Here's one I haven't heard of. Futuristic Management Group ripped off for $1 million. Unemployment benefits is way down on the list of $250 million. And then the donations went from groups of people such as Salim Saeed, Abdul Qadir Salah, Ahmed Omar Hashim, Abdi Salah. I'm not going to read all of these names. Right on down to a guy, Gandhi Muhammad. The donations went to, of course, Ilhan Omar, Fata, Jacob Frey, Keith Ellison. A lot of these donations went to Keith Ellison, and then Noor, and another one to another couple more to Ellison, and then to the DFL party generally. And there's a few others that are listed as donor recipients. And those tables show you this level of fraud that the money comes right out, and then people are giving kickbacks to their sort of chosen DFL candidate or the DFL party directly.
Yeah. I one thing, like just want to bring people's attention to too is if you go on Twitter or X, there is a whistleblower group. It's Minnesota spelled out _DHS. And there is a group of employees of the state who are trying to be whistleblowers of the waste, fraud, and abuse that's happening in the Department of Human Services. And so again, this is one more area of fraud, waste, and abuse. And then one other thing we haven't mentioned yet, Wes, because I mean, okay, if we were just dealing with one thing with the Feeding Our Future, I'm a person of grace and forgiveness, and you could be like, well, shame on us that went under the radar, we didn't catch it, but then show us, and Governor Walz hasn't, show us that he's serious and what he did to stop it, what he did to prevent it, from ever happening again in the future. But that's not the case. We have rampant fraud in the state of Minnesota, and it's under Governor Walz's watch. And that should be a red flag, not just for Minnesotans, and it should be, again, across party line, not to Democrats, not to Republicans, to everyone should understand there is rampant fraud happening in our state. From DHS to the Feeding Our Future to MDE, it's across these different elements all across the state. At some point now, again, you cannot be like, this is by mistake. We have a fraud problem in our state, which is going completely unchecked by the Governor Walz administration. That's on him. And it's on him to prove to the citizens of Minnesota that he's serious and what he's doing to clean this up. And it's been years and none of that has happened. And then the last one I wanted to talk about too was there's a frontline worker. There was a fund of $500 million. So imagine this. You were a frontline worker during COVID. You worked day after day. You put yourself out there. $500 million was put into a fund. And then as people applied, the money was supposed to be distributed to those frontline workers. A recent audit of that program showed 200 million of the 500 million cannot be accounted that it went to actual frontline workers who deserve that money. Now, just a quick math on that, that's 40% fraud. 40% fraud. So again, in the state of Minnesota, I'm a compassionate person who I believe in forgiveness, but you know what? I'm also a business owner. You run your family business, and I also believe in accountability, and I also believe in the Minnesota taxpayers that we owe it to them to show that we're a responsible state government and that we're serious about eliminating fraud and that we're being good stewards of their money. None of that is happening under Governor Walz. None of that is happening in the state of Minnesota or in his administration. There's been no accountability. There's been no going back and holding people accountable. There's been no one fired. And again, this is rampant fraud across the state, not just in one institution.
And now that Tim Walz is suddenly propelled into the national eye, it's kind of a mixed blessing, isn't it? That the whole of the United States is now looking at Minnesota saying, well, if it happened to them, do we really want to use that as a model for the American public generally, from California to Maine and Washington State to Florida? Do we really want to have this? Because he was, as you say, he was directly supervising these agencies. This is the thing that's most within his purview, how to be a responsible steward of taxpayers' money. And he failed miserably to supervise these programs. And there's been no oversight or accountability. Nobody's been properly investigated. And I'd like to see them actually arrested and jailed and forbidden from doing business with the state or any government agency in the future. They shouldn't be able, some of the same people keep popping up apparently again and again. And like you
Yeah.
said, it would have been easy. Sorry, Pam, go ahead.
Oh, doesn't that make, I mean, Wes, you make so much sense. We need you in the Minnesota State Legislature. How much sense does that make, that after someone was proven to be fraudulent or to do something unbecoming to the state of Minnesota, that they are basically, banned, even if it's for a short amount of time, for being a vendor of the state of Minnesota? That's just logic. That's just basic common sense, which is lacking right now in Minnesota with the Democrat trifecta, with the complete Democrat one-party control. No, I would love to see Democrats please stand up and say that you're against this. Say
Right.
that this is disgusting. Say that you want our state to be held accountable. Please, the silence is deafening on the side of the Democrats. Where are you? I mean,
It
where are
shouldn't be
these
a
people?
partisan issue. It shouldn't just be like, and now I'm seeing in chat rooms that the Democrat talking point is to say, well, the Republicans are going to find any excuse to make an issue out of fraud, waste, and abuse now that there's an election year. That is the most cynical nonsense I've ever heard. It's one of the reasons that I've become a Republican, is that party has left all common sense behind. And like the frontline workers pay, a lot of us who applied for this, and it's $46 million, $45.5 million. I mean, a million here and a million there after a while, who's counting, right? But $46 million ripped off. And a lot of us who were applying for that program back in the day were like, oh, did you get yours yet? No, I didn't get it. Oh, they say it's going to be $1,700. Oh, really? Oh, it's worth applying for, or they say it's going to be $1,400, or now I heard it's 12. It ended up being like a few $100 that they put in your account. And I was like looking at that deposit going, oh, big deal. Okay,
Well,
thank you very much. Well,
that's exactly what happened when you take a $500 million budget and you siphon off 40% of it went to potentially fraudulent people or people who did not deserve that money. What happened is it reduced the payments to the people who were actually out there fighting, during COVID and going to work day after day after day for us and for the public and to protect us. They were the ones out there, and they were the ones that got cheated out of these funds. And apparently, no one from the Governor Walz administration has remedied this, or is even trying to figure out where that money went. As far as I'm aware, I am not aware of anyone trying to hold anyone accountable for the fraud that happened in that.
on top of that, spending down the 17.5 billion in surplus, but that dog doesn't hunt anymore. It's almost like they just wait for things to go away, because the next scandal is going to be the crise du jour, and it's going to be bigger than the previous one. And then your nervous system just goes, oh, look over there, there's a new scandal, like the elder nutrition program. I can't think of a worse group of people to take food from, like take food off the table of grandpas and grandmas. Like, how do you even, like, who gets up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to go to work today and I'm going to rip off as many elderly people as I can? How can you live with yourself doing that? But
Right. Well, Wes, one thing I want to bring awareness to your listeners is in 2023, it was a bonding bill where we passed bonding out of the Minnesota State Legislature. And in that bonding bill, there was $183 million that was earmarked for nonprofits. 183 million. And
oh,
across all of the bills, all of the laws that were signed by Governor Walz in 2023. So think about this, going into 2023, we had this historic $18 billion surplus. Okay. $18 billion surplus. And $1.1 billion in 2023 was given through the Minnesota State Legislature to nonprofits. 1.1 billion. like I said, $183 million of that was just in the bonding, in the cash bonding bill. But is this an appropriate way for the state of Minnesota to be governing? I mean, what are we doing? We're basically handing over our ability to govern to nonprofits that we have no oversight over. We have no idea where this money is actually going. Is it going to be accountable? And yes, are there great nonprofits? Yes, Wes, there is. There is. I'm a compassionate person, and there are great nonprofits out there. But we have to be honest with our eyes wide open. And at some point, we have to have honest conversations and saying that these nonprofits are now the tool that they are using to funnel money away from the state, however you want to say it, that they're using this to steal money from the state of Minnesota government and your taxpayers. And apparently no one in the state of Minnesota of the Governor Walz administration cares enough to try to stop what's happening here in Minnesota. In fact, they're amplifying it. So the nonprofits are the system, the avenue that they are using to funnel money away from you, the taxpayers. And Wes, I would just say again, in the state of Minnesota, we need to bring awareness. The Minnesota media is not. And to any common sense Democrat out there, this is a wasteful place for us to be putting our dollars. I know there's nursing homes suffering, schools are suffering. There's a lot of places, roads, bridges, there's infrastructure, there's water treatment facilities. So there's a lot of places in the state of Minnesota that really do need our tax dollars to go to them. And when you see this amount of waste, and you know this is happening under Governor Walz, his administration, the Democrat trifecta, my goodness, hello, Democrats. I mean, someone's got to wake up. We've got to sound the alarm. We need to elect people like Wes in Rochester. We need to flip the Minnesota House. We need to put a backstop into our state government. We need to bring back accountability to the state of Minnesota. And I don't know, the sirens are going off in everywhere in the state of Minnesota, and it's up to the Minnesota people who are going to be voting this November to make a choice. You have a choice for a change. And I'll tell you right now, that there is no choice but to be voting for these Republican candidates. There's just absolutely no choice.
Well, thank you very much, Pam Altendorf. And I think you made the best possible sayonara here today for now. And I appreciate you and all you do as a fighter up there and a voice for the working people of Minnesota, the blue collar folks that to us, a dollar means a lot. And you look at the deductions in your paycheck, and maybe you make $20 on average per hour, but after deductions, you're taking home maybe $12 to $13 or $14, depending on your deductions. But thanks for all you do, because you're clearly a person who values the meaning of money and what it means to working people. Thank you so much, Pam Altendorf.
Thanks for having me, Wes. And let's go, Minnesota. Let's flip this state.
Thank you.